Iran has launched missile attacks affecting multiple Israeli cities in recent weeks, and one U.S. F-15E crew member remains missing after the aircraft was shot down over Iran. If this is where the war is now, then the question is no longer whether the region is spiraling. The question is how much worse it gets when Iranian missiles are hitting city after city in Israel while, somewhere over enemy territory, an American pilot still hasn't come home. That is the kind of moment wars are remembered for. Not because it is neat, not because it makes strategic sense on a whiteboard, but because it feels like the instant a conflict stops looking containable and starts looking personal, emotional, and dangerous in a completely different way. Because one headline by itself is easy to ignore. A missile strike here, a defense interception there. One more overnight barrage in a war that already feels impossible to track. But when the map starts filling in with Israeli cities under fire and then you add a missing American airman to the story, the whole thing changes tone. Suddenly, this is not just Israel versus Iran. It is not just another exchange of missiles and threats. It becomes a story about escalation, symbolism, and the terrifying possibility that even the most advanced militaries in the world do not fully control what happens next. The Guardian. And here's the part that should really get your attention. The Israeli home front has already been stretched across multiple regions and cities during this war. Public reporting has documented Iranian strikes affecting places including Tel Aviv, Haifa, West Jerusalem, Beit Shemesh, Dimona, Arad, and other parts of central and northern Israel. Some missiles were intercepted, some were allowed to fall in open areas under protocol, some still hit, some killed, some injured. And every single wave carried the same message: nowhere feels completely outside the envelope anymore. The Times of Israel. That is the first thing people get wrong. They think missile warfare is only about direct hits. It is not. It is about pressure. It is about forcing millions of people to live by sirens, shelters, and the kind of tension that makes normal life feel temporary. The strike does not have to level a city to leave a mark. It just has to interrupt enough ordinary life that the entire country starts measuring time differently. One alert at a time, one scramble at a time, one terrifying wait at a time. That is how strategic pressure really works. The Times of Israel. And that is why this story feels so much bigger than a battlefield update. Because the emotional picture is brutal. 5 cities, or more, under attack over time. Israeli families rushing underground again. Holy places, residential blocks, industrial zones, and civilian streets all dragged into the same war rhythm. And while all of that is happening, one American crew member is still missing after a U.S. F-15E was shot down over Iran, with rescue operations and search efforts reportedly still underway. You do not need to be a military analyst to understand what that means. It means the conflict is already charging a price in fear, uncertainty, and human vulnerability on both sides of the map. The Guardian. Now stop for a second and think about how dark that really is. America is not just watching this war anymore. It is bleeding into it in a way ordinary viewers instantly understand. A missing pilot is not an abstract policy problem. It is a face without a finish line. It is a family staring at a phone. It is commanders trying to project control while knowing that every hour behind enemy lines changes the stakes. And once that enters the story, every new Iranian missile strike lands inside a different frame. Not just another barrage. Now it feels like part of a widening contest in which the United States is no longer safely outside the blast radius of consequence. The Guardian. This is where the story becomes genuinely gripping. Because on one side, Iran is showing it can still hit Israeli cities, still create panic, still impose a psychological tax even against one of the most layered missile defense systems on Earth. On the other side, the United States and Israel are showing that this campaign is not cost-free for Tehran either, but the missing American crew member proves something uncomfortable. Even overwhelming military sophistication does not erase risk. It only changes the form risk takes. Achar. The Guardian. And here is the concrete example that tells you how quickly war can puncture confidence. Earlier in this conflict, an Iranian missile strike in Beit Shemesh killed 9 civilians, showing in the harshest way possible that even protected spaces and familiar neighborhoods can become lethal in seconds. That one event alone shattered the illusion that this would remain a war of distant flashes and successful interceptions. Once civilians die in places that look recognizably normal, the conflict stops feeling remote, even for people who thought they had emotionally adjusted to the headlines. Wikipedia. That is the pattern to watch, not just whether missiles are launched, whether the attacks keep proving that the shield is not the same thing as safety. Most of the incoming fire may be intercepted, yes, but that does not make the pressure unreal. It means the population still lives under a rain of warnings and probabilities, and in strategic terms that can be enough to disrupt schools, businesses, travel, religion, politics, and the national mood. Enough to keep the sense of siege alive. Enough to force decision makers to ask whether they are still containing the war or merely enduring it. The times of Israel. Now bring the missing U.S. pilot back into the frame, because this is where the entire narrative tightens. One American crew member was rescued after the F-15E was shot down. The second remained missing according to multiple reports today, with AP saying Iran even called on the public to help find the enemy pilot. Whether that ends in rescue, recovery, or something worse, it creates a kind of suspense that changes the emotional chemistry of the conflict. Because now, there is a human countdown embedded in the war. Every strike, every speech, every rescue rumor, every escalation, it all sits under that shadow, the Guardian. And that is why this story is so combustible for a U.S. audience. Americans understand alliances, they understand missile defense, they understand foreign policy language. But what cuts through all of that is one missing pilot behind enemy lines while allied cities are taking fire. That is not a complicated frame. That is movie-level tension, except it is real. And when reality starts borrowing the structure of a war thriller, people lock in because they know one bad turn can change everything. The Guardian. Now here's the most important question. What is Iran actually trying to prove with these attacks? The answer is not simply that it can damage Israel. It is trying to prove endurance, that even after weeks of war, it can still reach population centers, still generate fear, still force defenses to stay active, still keep the conflict alive in civilian minds. That matters because wars are not won only by destruction. They are shaped by who convinces the other side that the pain will continue. The times of Israel. And what is Israel with U.S. backing trying to prove in response? That the attacks can be absorbed, reduced, intercepted, and eventually outlasted. That this barrage strategy will not break the state, the alliance, or the political will to keep fighting. But that is a hard message to maintain when the strike map keeps spreading and an American aircrew member is still unaccounted for. Because resilience sounds strong at a podium. It feels very different in a shelter or in a search mission over hostile ground. The Guardian. This is why the next phase matters so much. There are really three paths from here. 1. The attacks keep coming, but their strategic impact fades because defenses hold, the civilian system adapts, and the missing U.S. pilot is recovered, stripping some of the drama out of the moment. 2. Iran keeps enough pressure alive to make every few days feel like a new emergency, while the unresolved pilot story deepens U.S. involvement emotionally and politically. Or 3, a larger strike or failed rescue operation creates a spike in casualties or symbolism that pushes the war into an even more dangerous chapter. Those are the real possibilities. The Guardian. And if you want my honest read, it is this. The danger is not just in the missiles. The danger is in the overlap. Multiple Israeli cities under threat over time. A missing American crew member. A conflict that keeps generating moments intense enough to demand retaliation, but messy enough to deny closure. That combination is what turns a regional war into a psychological grinder. One that keeps both publics tense, keeps governments under pressure, and keeps the rest of the world wondering whether the next headline will finally be the one that forces a much bigger response. The Guardian. But because wars become most dangerous right when they stop feeling new and start feeling survivable. That is when leaders can convince themselves they understand the pattern. That is when publics can start normalizing sirens and casualty counts. That is when one missing pilot, one direct hit, one unusually successful barrage, or one failed interception can suddenly shatter the illusion that the current level of horror is somehow stable. And that is exactly why this moment matters. It looks like just another spike in a war. It could actually be the part people look back on and say, that was when the whole thing became harder to contain. The Guardian. So if you want the clean bottom line, here it is. Iran's attacks on Israeli cities are not just about physical damage. They are about proving reach, stamina, and psychological pressure. The missing U.S. pilot is not just a military detail. It is the kind of human flashpoint that can intensify American attention, emotion, and resolve overnight. Put those two things together, and you get a conflict that is no longer running on strategy alone. It is running on symbolism, nerves, and the terrifying possibility that the next move from either side will be made under maximum pressure. The Guardian. And that is why this story does not let go. Because the war is no longer just happening on radar screens or in briefing rooms. It is happening in city shelters, in rescue missions, in missing person timelines, and in the minds of millions of people who can feel that the gap between bad and much worse is getting thinner by the day.